Thank you very much. Can I just check that everyone can hear me well enough? Good. Thank you very much indeed. And may I just remind you, as I said last week, these devotions come really, these Bible studies come as devotional reflections rather than as academic exegesis. So as I said last week, also, if any of your New Testament scholars, now's the time to go and get a cup of coffee. But today we're going to reflect on a story which I've always found endlessly fascinating, the story of the Samaritan woman at the well outside Sychar. And I'm really interested to hear of that statue to which you referred, Tim. You must send me a link for it, because I like to collect things of the Samaritan lady. Can you see this? I'm never quite sure how to get this in relation to the camera. This is a beautiful olive wood statuette that I picked up in Bethlehem some years ago, made out of olive wood. The Israeli army sometimes knocks down the olive trees in the interest, supposedly, of security, and the Palestinians make beautiful things from it. And here's my woman with the well at the bottom, and there she is. And this one here, I bought in China some years ago, and I don't know if you can see, but Jesus and the woman are very clearly of Oriental origin. And there's the well down at the bottom, a rather more substantial well, and a weeping willow. And this is sandalwood. You can't smell it, but I can, and it's lovely. So let's first hear the story, and I think David is going to read, followed by Margaret. If you would, David, please.
Reading from John chapter 4. But he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as those to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming. who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. Just then his disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with a woman. But no one said, What do you want? Or why are you speaking with her? Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? They left the city and were on their way to him. May God add his blessing.
Thank you, David. And Margaret?
Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I've ever done. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Saviour of the world.
Thank you both very much indeed. As we look at this passage, I'd like us to consider, first of all, the place, the location of this story, and then to reflect a little on wells and living water, so to speak, but particularly on wells as we find them mentioned in the Bible, and then to look at the woman herself. As Tim pointed out at the beginning, you probably heard this reading, or you may have heard this reading on Sunday last, because it's the Gospel lection for the third Sunday in Lent in Year A of the Revised Common Lectionary. And it's a very powerful story. And together with that story from John are other readings about water we find in various places in the Bible, and the need for it both physically and spiritually. To look at where this happened. At the time of Jesus, most Jewish travelers going from Jerusalem in the south up to Galilee in the north would prefer to take a longer route rather than going straight through Samaria. They would cross the Jordan just south of Samaria, go up the east side of the bank of the Jordan, and then cross back over again when they had gone past Samaria, so that they could avoid going through that part, because as we read in several places in the Bible, Jews and Samaritans were mutually hostile. Sometime when you've a minute, you may like to read Nehemiah chapter 4, where we read of a particularly unpleasant encounter between the Jewish people coming back to rebuild their city and the locals, who were the Samaritans, and were not a bit amused by this. We also find in the gospel reflections of this, Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus bids the disciples not to go through Samaria preaching the gospel, and also Luke 9. Let me just see if I can see all of you now. Full screen. There we are. I think I got to the point where I was saying that the Samaritans deviated from the Jews who were in exile, who had held on to their rights and their practices as part of their identity of a people. So when they came back to the land which they believed had been promised to them, they were not very happy about those who had moved away from that in any way. And then historically, during the time of the Maccabees and later in the time of the Romans, the Samaritans were treated differently to the way in which the Jewish people were treated. So that was not very good. Hence the words between Jesus and the woman we hear, you Jews, you Samaritans, not very inclusive. Sychar was geographically near Mount Gerizim, which was the seat of worship for the Samaritans, and it's often associated with the modern town of Nablus, the city of Nablus. The well in question is not actually mentioned in the Old Testament, though as Jacob had lands in that part, and you read about this in Genesis 38, he would have needed to have a well, because no point in that particular environment and having land and not having a supply of water associated with it. So that brings us to the matter of wells. And the biblical references to wells, I think, are very interesting. I don't know how many of you have been to Palestine, Israel, but I've been a number of times. And wells and aquifers were places where water might be reliably found, where water was and still is protected and owned. And in biblical times, certainly wells were a center for social activity, not least the activity of women. And we read several times in the Old Testament of people meeting those they were to marry at wells. So just a few of the people who met around wells. Well, Hagar, trying to escape from Abraham and Sarah, found herself at a well twice. Eliezer discovered Rebecca at a well. Jacob meets Rachel at a well. Moses met his wife and sisters-in-law at a well in Midian, as Exodus tells us. And then there's some really interesting stories about wells. One I particularly like, we find in 2 Samuel chapter 17, where Jonathan and Ahimaaz go hiding in a well. They are being sought by David. So the owner of the property on which they find themselves puts them down a well, and his wife scatters grain over the top of the well. So, well, who would expect to find anyone down there? And then we read in Nehemiah also of the Israelites going through foreign lands and promising the ruler, we will not drink from any of your wells. A useful promise to make, because obviously people were always in search of water. And then we find in Luke, Jesus rebuking the Pharisees and scribes who have rebuked him in turn for healing somebody. And he points out, if an ox or a donkey falls down a well, don't you get it out immediately, whether it is the Sabbath or not? And yes, of course they do, because they couldn't risk water being contaminated. And now we have this story of a woman at a well. And water was, and of course still is, a vitally important matter in the Middle East. Then, as now, it's precious and scarce. Then, as now, it can be weaponized and be the subject of struggle. So, Ruth, if you can pick up a few illustrations that I sent you of how other people have interpreted this story. I think it's interesting to interpret the story in words, but it's also interesting to see how artists have interpreted it. Here is the icon that is associated with the retreat organization. It's a very typical icon, and you will know that icons are written and not painted. And here we have Jesus sitting by the well with something of a tree there, and the woman dressed in green has her little container, and they're obviously having a conversation. The disciples are lurking there behind a rock in the left background, and coming out of the city are some of the rather more formally dressed people who are clearly going to come and see what all this is about. Icon writers very often put several episodes of the one story into the one icon. So that's that one. I think it's rather beautiful. I love the colors in it. They're very vibrant. And the next one, Ruth. Now, this is a window from a church in a small town in West Cork. And next week, I'll show you the other half of it. And here we have Jesus sitting at a well, holding forth to the Samaritan woman who has a jar there. It's a really very beautiful window. I think the leading feature in this particular church. And it's put with the story of Mary and Martha. And next week, we'll see how the stained glass artist manages to differentiate among the women by the different headdresses they're wearing. But there is the woman holding forth, and Jesus also holding forth to her. The next one, Ruth, please. And here is a picture by Angelika Kaufmann, who is an 18th century artist of Swiss background, who spent a significant amount of her time in England and in Italy. She was a very close friend, some would say a very close friend indeed, of Joshua Reynolds. And she has painted a very, I think, energetic picture of the woman at the well, and you can see they're both gesticulating with their hands, arguing with each other. The bucket is rather more substantial than either of the other two representations, and you can see Mount Gerizim there in the background, which is a subject of their conversation. Thank you very much, Ruth. So we turn to reflecting on the woman herself. Now, tradition tells us, and there is a large amount of tradition accruing around this particular woman, tradition tells us that she was baptized with the name of Photine, which means the enlightened one. And she's still significantly revered in the Eastern Orthodox and the Eastern Catholic traditions, revered as a saint. And as I said earlier, many icons have been written about her. She has 3 feast days in their calendar. One we just passed, which it was the 26th of February. In the Slavic Orthodox tradition, her feast day is upcoming. It's the 20th of March. And the 5th Sunday of Easter is known as the Sunday of the Samaritan woman. So she gets quite a lot of recognition liturgically in some of our sister churches. It's said of her that after her conversion to the man she had met at the well, she converted her 5 sisters and her 2 sons, and that after Peter and Paul were martyred, Photine and her family left Samaria to travel to Carthage in North Africa to proclaim the gospel of Christ there. And then in 66 AD, we are told, under the persecution of Emperor Nero, they were all martyred. So that's what we are told about her. And who knows? I mean, there may be threads of truth in this. It's written of her by the theologian, the early church father Ephraim the Syrian, the following, and I think this is really interesting. At the beginning of the conversation, Jesus did not make himself known to her, but she caught sight of a thirsty man, then a Jew, then a rabbi, afterwards a prophet, last of all, the Messiah. She tried to get the better of the thirsty man. She showed dislike of the Jew. She heckled the rabbi. She was swept off her feet by the prophet. And she adored the Christ. Now, we need to take Ephraim of the Syrian seriously because John Wesley included him in a couple of lists of recommended reading, as, for example, in The Plain Account of Genuine Christianity in 1753, and also his address to the clergy of the Church of England in 1756. So we should take Ephraim the Syrian seriously. Western tradition has often regarded her as a prostitute, or at least as a woman of loose living. But it has to be said, and on the basis of what we read in John chapter 4, that it's at least as likely that she was a serial widow, so to speak, the victim of tragic circumstances. As you know from other parts in the Bible, the book of Ruth, if a woman was left widowed, then the husband's next of kin was entitled, if that's the correct word, to marry her. So she may well have been the victim of very tragic circumstances. And we reminded, however, that last week we reflected that John the Evangelist recounts stories for a purpose. They take the place, as we reflected, of the parables in the Synoptic Gospels. And in this particular connection, some scripture scholars have noted that the Samaritan woman had 5 husbands, 1 partner, so to speak, and now at the well she meets the Christ, bringing the total number of men in her life to 7. Now, in the Jewish tradition, 7 is the number of completeness. And put this against the fact that wells were the location where those who were to be married often met, we wonder if this is John's version of the church in the person of the Samaritan woman as the bride of Christ. And in the letter to the Ephesians, but also in the book of the Revelation, there are a number of references to the church as the bride of Christ. So you might sometime like to reflect on that one. But anyway, to return to the biblical story, she was a woman She was a Gentile, a Samaritan, a person with an apparently complicated life, and these were all good reasons for not engaging her in conversation, certainly from the perspective of the disciples, who kept remarkably quiet about it, it has to be said. For some reason, and for whatever reason it was, she was not socially acceptable to the other women of her town. Women usually travelled, both for company and for safety, in groups to wells, and in the cool of the day to keep their water cool. And here she is, on her own, in the heat of the day, at noon, the 6th hour. And we ask ourselves, why? One of many questions we might ask arising out of this story. It is, I think, very interesting to compare this particular conversation with the conversation recorded earlier by John with Nicodemus. They are different in almost every respect. The conversation with Nicodemus happens at night. This one happens during the day. Nicodemus is clearly a man. Photine is a woman. Nicodemus is clearly a pillar of society. He's a teacher of the law. This woman certainly has a suspect reputation. Nicodemus is an observant Jew, otherwise he wouldn't be where he was. And she is a Samaritan. The two conversations juxtaposed in John's Gospel make for an interesting reflection in themselves. And it's interesting to notice that as they debate, these two debate partners with Jesus, the woman grasps the truth far more readily than Nicodemus. And she's a theologically reflective debating partner. Nicodemus, in what you might say was a Pharisaical way, is concerned about the niceties of the new birth. How can this happen? He interprets it, of course, in physical terms. Whereas the Samaritan woman, Photine, is occupied with the subject of worship. And worship is mentioned 9 times within 5 verses in the account we listened to earlier as David read it. And it's interesting that certainly in the picture by Angelika Kaufmann, Mount Gerizim comes between the two, the figure of Jesus and the figure of the woman in her painting. Worship is the center of their conversation. And her conversation with Jesus is the longest conversation recorded in the Gospels that Jesus has with anyone. And significantly, it is to her, and to her only, that Jesus acknowledges that he is the Messiah. I, who speak to you, am he. Jesus addresses her in the same way as he spoke to his mother, as we noticed in the story of the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee last week. Woman. And we recognize then that this was not necessarily being abrupt or curt with her. And we see here the human side, a human side of Jesus, Son of God and Son of Mary. He was tired. He sat down by the well. His disciples went into the town of Sychar to buy food. And he was thirsty, but not able to access the water, even though travelers at the time did generally carry their own leather buckets with them for putting down wells. Another interesting thing about this story that we may like to reflect on is that just as in the synoptic accounts of the calling of the disciples, those disciples left their nets to go and follow Jesus. So the woman, John tells us, left her bucket, her precious bucket, by the well to go into the town to tell the message, to convey the message of who she had met to her townspeople. She's often referred to, certainly by the early church fathers and in the Orthodox tradition, as the apostle to the Gentiles. She is the first who goes to speak to those who are outside the Jewish community. She goes to talk to her own people. And she uses the same terms that the evangelist John has already used of people calling others to see Jesus. She says, "Come and see." Jesus says this to two disciples at the beginning of the gospel. "Where are you living?" they want to know. "Come and see," he said. And Philip says it to Nathanael. Come and see who I found." She says exactly the same. Come and see. And we've talked a little bit about the wedding imagery that we find in this story, the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee, the wedding arrangements done at wells. And we ask ourselves the question we asked just a few minutes ago. Is this story about the church and the church being married to Christ? And the question, because the central figure is a Samaritan woman, is, for those reading John's Gospel, does the new Israel, in fact, include the Gentiles? And we're reminded of that wonderful verse from Isaiah chapter 12. With joy, you will draw water from the well of salvation. And so here we have a foreign place, in many respects, for Jewish people, a dangerous place. We have a well, a place with resonance to all peoples living in the Middle East because of its living water. And by living water is meant flowing water rather than static water. Jesus refers to himself as living water. I'm not just here, I'm living. Photine breaks the boundaries of gender, of race, of social class, and of religious affiliation. And what has she got to teach us? What are we to make of her? And those are questions we might now like to reflect on.